The philosopher about whom we will talk today is allegedly influential on Putin and the Kremlin, but also on Steve Bannon. His ideological influences include fascism, but also postmodernism. He has shaped a political movement called National Bolshevism, and yet he has an appeal in many in the so-called American dissident right, but also among libertarians. He is Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher who envisions a conflict, a cataclysmic conflict between Russia and the West. Who is this mysterious man? What are his ideas? What is his actual influence on Putin? And why has he got an appeal among some conservatives? This is Nikos Sotirakopoulos, and this is New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. With me today is Ziemowit Gowin, a junior fellow in the Ayn Rand Institute who is making his debut in New Idea Live. So,
Hi.
Ziemowit, we will discuss the ideas of Alexander Dugin. So, first of all, tell us why is he important in terms of understanding Russia and understanding how many people in Russia view the world.
Yeah, so Nikos, basically, Dugin is a Russian ultranationalist who perceives the world as a chessboard of a geopolitical battle between Russia and the West, especially the US as the leader of the West. But for Dugin, it's much more. It's not just geopolitics. It's not just a geopolitical battle, but it's also a metaphysical battle, a battle between ideas, battle between values. And so he sees the West as standing for evil values, for evil ideas such as freedom, progress, reason, individualism. And on the other hand, you have Russia, which stands for good values such as tradition, religion, collectivism. And so, so the war in Ukraine for Dugin is just a small part. It's a smaller part of a bigger picture of bigger this big battle between holy Russia and the evil West, especially evil United States. And of course, he vehemently supports the war in Ukraine. He's what you might call a Russian hawk. So he basically supports, he says that the Russian army should be merciless and use all its power to crush Ukrainians who are, according to Dugin, basically Russians, but Russians who don't know that they are Russians. Now, as for his influence in Russia, especially on the Kremlin, now it's being debated. So some people say that he's Putin's brain. Some other experts point to the fact that he has no official ties to the Kremlin. He's never met with Putin. But we know that there is some influence nonetheless. And I think that last August, there was an assassination attempt. Some group, we don't know officially who, it might have been the Ukrainians, but we don't know who, tried to take Dugin down. Now, instead, they planted a bomb under a car that he was supposed to get in. He didn't. And instead of Dugin, his daughter, Daria, died. So I think that it shows that there is some influence. And even if there's no like direct influence on the Kremlin and on Putin, he's influential in a lot of radical militant groups in Russia. And so I think it's enough influence so that we can discuss this figure.
And we know for a fact that Dugin used to teach in the military academy of the general staff of the Russian army. We know that he has the ear of many high-ranking Russian officers, And also, we know that there are many influential people with money in Russia that give their support to the ideas of Dugin. So, the first thing I want our audience to understand is that Dugin is fundamentally and openly opposed to the West, as West understood as a civilization. So his main problem is not American imperialism. His main problem is not some particular leadership in the United States. He's opposed to the West as a civilization because he's openly opposed to individualism and he's openly opposed to the idea of freedom and to the idea of modernity. So it's very rare that you have a philosopher who opens his cards and say, these are my premises. And his premises are openly, I am against modernity. I want to return to a point of time which is before modernity. So tell us a bit more about the history of this guy, because it's quite interesting to see from how many movements he has collected his ideas. So as we'll see, he's quite eclectic. He tries to find what are the enemies of modernity, of freedom, of liberalism. Whatever is the enemy, I want to get something because I want to attack these ideas from every possible angle. So Ziemowit, tell us a bit about the history of Alexander Dugin.
Yeah, so basically, Dugin is a philosopher, I would say, particularly a political philosopher. He's a public intellectual, especially, of course, mostly in Russia, but, well, recently not only. He's a prolific author. He's published dozens of books, such as Eurasian Mission, the United States and the New World Order, the Fourth Political Theory, or Political Platonism, to name but a few. Now, as for his political activism, when you take a look at his history, for example, in the early 90s, he's one of the leaders of the National Bolshevism movement. He's a co-founder of the National Bolshevik Party. But also, when you look at his past, you
Sorry,
can
just to
see
clarify
his
here for our audience, when we say
yeah.
national Bolsheviks, people need to understand this is, if you can imagine it, a mix of ultranational fascists and communists. So Dugin says, which are the two ideologies that attack freedom more? Communism and fascist. I want a bit of both. So he creates this very weird movement, national Bolsheviks, which never really took off, but he maintained, even when he gave up on the project, he maintained this idea that anything that attacks liberalism, I'm for it.
Yeah, I mean, even if we go back in the past to the early 80s when he was pretty young, uh, he was a member of of an illegal far right group called the Black Order of SS. So, and it also explains it's an example of his interest and fascination with esotericism, especially esotericism in the Third Reich, but not only. He's also fascinated with religion. So I think that in probably in 1997 he becomes a member of Old Believers. It's an Eastern Orthodox Christian sect. And then, of course, he is mostly known for his for being one of the leaders, or maybe the leader of Eurasianism. So Eurasianism is an ideology that sees Russia as a standalone civilization, which is neither European nor Asian. That is, thus, it's Eurasian. And he was also, now you mentioned, Nikos, that he was teaching in the military academy of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. And so basically he was trying to make his Eurasianist ideology a strategic paradigm in the Russian forces. And so if you combine all of this, and this is just, a few facts about him, if you combine all of this, you get I would say, pretty honestly, a crazy eclecticism of mysticism, of religion, or even religions, and totalitarianism.
And what is the final product of this mix of the different ideas for Dugin? His amalgam of all these ideas is what he calls the fourth political theory. So first of all, let's understand why fourth. What are the first three? The first three are liberalism, communism, and fascism. And for Dugin, there is a need for a fourth paradigm, for a fourth theory, because there is a problem with fascism and communism. And the main problem with fascism and communism is that they failed to crush liberalism. So for Dugin, the main question is what will be the political paradigm that will crush liberalism, that will crush modernity. By modernity, he means what we understand as the Enlightenment, the period of the Industrial Revolution, the time where humanity made this huge leap towards the society that we've enjoyed in the last 200 or so years. So for Dugin, modernity is the biggest disaster, the biggest catastrophe in the history of humanity, and therefore it needs to be destroyed. Now, he says that communism and fascism has some good things and some bad things, but in any case, they're not really relevant anymore because they failed to defeat liberalism. And he claims that liberalism is the biggest evil that the world has seen, so it's way worse than communism and fascism. So it's interesting to see what he considered the pros and cons of communism and fascism, because he says we can keep some stuff in our battle against liberalism. So let's start with communism. Good thing for communism, according to Dugin, it's collectivism. So it's at its center is not the individual, which we will see is the ultimate evil. At its center is a group, the class. Good thing for fascism, indeed, that at its center is also a group, the ethnos, the nation. Now, another good thing for communism is its attack on bourgeois society, its attack on liberalism, its attack on capitalism. Therefore, we keep that stuff from fascism. But not a good thing in fascism, according to Dugin, is racism. Can you guess why? Not because it's a collectivist view of the world or whatever, but because he says racism is it's claiming that you can judge other cultures. As we see, for Dugin, no one can judge anyone. Of course, we can judge the West that it's horrible, but otherwise, every culture is to be beyond any judgment. So for him, racism is not very practical. And from communism, he doesn't like the fact that it was too materialistic. It promised progress. And for Dugin, progress is a dirty word. So why is liberalism then the ultimate evil? It is the ultimate evil because at its center, because as its unit, it has the individual. At its unit, it has the free human being. So Dugin says, his words in quotes, we must strike the individual, abolish him, and cast him into the periphery of political consideration. End of quote. I don't think I've heard ever a philosopher putting it so bluntly that the individual is to be crushed, is to be destroyed. And a phrase that many of us hold as very, very significant and a very, very good idea, that man is the measure of all things. For Dugin, this is the motto that is the absolute evil. This is a motto which needs to be once and for all destroyed. So the question now is, Ziemowit, why does he have such disdain for the idea of freedom and the idea of individualism?
Yeah, for Dugin, so Dugin claims that in liberalism, the normative subject is the individual. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because in practice, it means that the individual is freed from various communities, from family, from tribe, or from nation. And it leads to basically destroying ethnos. Now, ethnos for Dugin, it's a community of language, shared practices, religious beliefs. Basically, ethnos is a group of people who perceive the world in the same, or at least in a very similar way. They have the same language. He also refers to Wittgenstein's idea of language games, and so on. And so liberalism destroys it. Why? Well, because it liberates the individual from ethnos, and it's, of course, it's incompatible with ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is the idea that it is the ethnos that should be the normative subject, not the
To
individual.
translate, because it's a Greek word, to translate it maybe for some people who are not very familiar with it, it's loosely can be translated as the nation.
Yes,
So
he
ethnos
even,
is
I
the
think,
nation.
yes, Nikos, I think that he even uses the word narod, which, at least in Polish, means literally nation.
Mhm.
So, what are the other problems with liberalism and individualism? And they're all interconnected. So, of course, it also destroys tradition. And tradition is one of the most important aspects of ethnos. Um, but it also leads to globalism. Why is globalism wrong? Why is it for Dugin even evil? Well, it's evil because globalism spreads what? Individualism and liberalism. And so it's destroying various ethnoses around the globe. And also, so he talks a lot about the evil aspects of liberalism. Some are sound, some are less sound. So for example, he also says that liberalism protects the rights of a small man, but real freedom is freedom of great men. Now he doesn't really explains what he means by that, but what I guess is that it means that the freedom of great men is the freedom to be oppressive rulers of a nation or of a group. Um, and also he has some absurd claims about liberalism, that it's responsible for humanitarian crimes, for wars, and, for example, for slavery. And he says that explicitly. But basically, we can sum it up as saying that for Dugin, liberalism and individualism are wrong, are evil, are to be destroyed. Why? Because they are against collectivism. And I think that ultimately Dugin is for collectivism.
He is indeed. So the unit of the fourth political theory for Dugin is the ethni, which is the plural of ethnos, or to put it in simple terms, the nations. Now, terms and conditions apply. If your nation is Ukraine or another Baltic state, tough luck. But otherwise, he believes that the, 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 the subject, our point of attention should not be in the individual, it should be the group. And also the standards based on how these nations, these ethnic, organize their life is tradition. Which tradition? Any tradition. So for Dugin, tradition is good no matter what. Is your tradition to do, I don't know, human sacrifices? Good, it's your tradition. Is your tradition to engage in, I don't know what horrible practices? It's okay, it's your tradition. Now, for Dugin, remember, we cannot judge other cultures or other traditions, and we will see, we will see why. So, for him, the aim is to reach some level of quote freedom, but not freedom for the individual, freedom for the ethnic to follow their destiny. Who is to tell what that destiny is? We never find out. What does that quote freedom to pursue the destiny means? Again, we never know. So notice here what the fourth political theory tells us. And for Dugin, it's actually virtues that it's an quote open theory. So Dugin tells us, take the ideas that have led to humanity's biggest achievements and biggest progress that we've ever seen, from human lifespan to wealth created to eradicating diseases. Take all this, Dugin says, and throw it away. For what? For something that he won't bother to tell us, for something which is, quote, open. So this is what Dugin asks us to do. He tells us, throw away modernity for something which you will feel it. We never find out what it is that we will feel. So, the question now that I want to address is, what is the philosophical basis? What is the philosophical structure based on which Dugin can build these very, very, in my view, despicable ideas? And it's a
Nikos,
crucial
before
point.
you,
Yeah.
yeah, before we go to that, you said that, yeah, that if you're a Baltic state, tough luck. And I think it's very important to emphasize that for Dugin, what matters is really Russia. He says Russia is everything, all else is nothing. And so that is why he believes that the nations that the Russian Empire or the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union sees as Russian, they can basically take them. And so it applies to Ukraine, it applies to Belarus, and it probably also applies to the Baltic states. So it's a peaceful coexistence only to the extent that these other groups, these other countries or nations are not deemed as Russian.
And you said that he's full of contradictions, and we see the contradiction here. The contradiction is a diversity of nations that are all equal, and at the same time, Russia above everything else, Russia über alles. So, what
Yeah.
can be the worldview of someone who comes up, like Dugin, who comes up with such ideas? And this is a crucial point, because if we understand what are the premises of Dugin, and if we see to what horrendous ideas they lead, and we will see some more of his horrendous ideas, we will have to be in the lookout for such premises. When we see other movements having these premises, we have to say we need to be very careful with these movements and with these ideas because they're not up to good. So Dugin goes back to Aristotle. Now, in theory, he praises Aristotle. But when he tries to spot when things started going wrong, he goes to Aristotle's formulation of A is A, something that will be familiar to many of our viewers who are familiar with objectivism also. So what does A is A mean? It means that this is a cup and it cannot be anything else at the same time. It cannot be a dinosaur, it cannot be a football, this is a cup. Everything is something specific. Everything has an identity, everything has a nature. For Dugin, this is hierarchical and oppressive. The idea that there is one truth, that the idea there is one reality, for Dugin is not a good thing. For Dugin, this is a Western, this is almost the West trying to, in a racist and imperialistic way, impose its worldview on other places and on other cultures. Because for Dugin, there is a Russian truth, there is a Western truth, there is an indigenous truth, a female truth, and many other truths. Dugin tells us explicitly, I quote him, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. And also for Dugin, there is no such thing as an objective standard based on which we can judge things are good or bad. No. Dugin, to have an objective standard would mean that one form of knowing, one form of coming into contact with reality, put differently, one epistemology is superior to others. And for Dugin, this is not the case. For Dugin, primitive societies who, I don't know, read the stars and predict the future, this is just a different form of knowing. So it's just a different, as he says, quote, logos. So the West, according to Dugin, is guilty, except from all the other things, because it is trying to present its values as universal and as superior. So the question I have for you, Ziemowit, is the following one. Here we have someone who says, it's racist to claim that there is one truth, all cultures are the same, And we cannot say that one culture is better than another culture, even if it's the most industrialized and developed culture compared to a primitive culture. And there are no facts, only interpretations. Does it remind you of any other movement that is quite trendy actually in the last decades?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean it does, and I think that we can think about Dugin as a proud postmodernist. Now, why? Well, basically because he's using postmodern thought as a tool to attack the epistemological premises of liberalism, which amounts to reason. So, for Dugin, reason is an enemy. Again, reason for Dugin is an enemy. Well, why? Basically, because it destroyed the Christian epistemology with our spiritual link to the transcendental, non material reality. So instead, because of reason, it placed materialism over spiritual values, or it placed the tradesman over the noble warrior. And so, as an example, Dugin complains about gravity being explained in terms of science and in terms of physics. Well, why? Because it ruined the spiritual understanding of gravity as the orientation of the soul towards the earth. And that is why, so reason is an enemy, and that is why Dugin welcomes any form of irrationality, which for him can be used as a shield against reason. So cults, spiritual traditions, religions, even the occult. And when you and again, now we're going moving back to what we've said about his past. When you look at his life, you know that he's interested. He has this fascination with uh, esotericism, with the occult. So, for example, I think in the late 90s, he has links to the Order of the Temple of the East, which is an occult organization per se. And so Dugin practices what he preaches because of his interest and his dealings with various groups, various mystical groups. But also another consequence of Dugin's postmodern approach is the way he uses words or terms, or we could say concepts. So he uses them basically as he wants. So he stretches them. So, for example, progress, he sometimes calls it genocide. Uh, for example, the fact that some people accept liberalism, he says that it's that because of that liberalism is basically racism, or that violates the rights of the ancestors. And so when you read Dugin, you see a lot of um, heavy concepts like genocide, like racism, slavery, used in a very unusual ways. And I think that it's part of his postmodern way of thinking, or philosophizing, if you will.
And how tragic, intellectually tragic, that the ideas that come out of such a personality like Dugin are ideas that will be familiar to everyone studying in humanities in a Western university, because they say exactly the same things. There is not one standard of reality. There is not one truth. You cannot say that one culture is better than another culture. So let us see now what are the practical consequences of these ideas by Dugin. So, if there is a Russian truth which is inexplicable to anyone else and we should not be able to judge it, then this gives Dugin a carte blanche. This gives him a free rein and a free rein to Russia to do anything it wants, and no one can actually comment on it. So, for example, If Russia attacks another sovereign country and tries to annihilate it, for Dugin, this is for his truth is that this is just a spiritual experience, and this is just Russia trying to do a service to the world and establishing a multipolar world, which is the big idea behind his geopolitics, that we need a multipolarity and a multipolar world. Or there was an interview, and someone, a Western journalist, asked Dugin, how do you comment about Russian jets dropping bombs on Aleppo? And Dugin replies, but what is a jet? What is a bomb? What is Aleppo? What do you mean that the bomb fall on innocent victims? What are these words? These words mean something for you, but they do not mean something for me. So the guy, it's like he comes out of the pages of Atlas Shrugged and being a villain. I remember that for those of you who have read the book, after the tunnel disaster, there's this philosopher who says, who knows if there was a tunnel disaster? Because how can you know there is a tunnel? How can you know that these people who die even ever existed? So this, you watch an interview of Dugin, and it's as if you're seeing these bad villainous philosophers out of Atlas Shrugged. But notice also how Putin is using a similar narrative which says that we have our own truth and the West should not be able to criticize it. So at some point, Putin says that Ukraine, the state of Ukraine, passing some reforms that have to do with sidestepping the Russian culture or the Russian language, he says that this is the equivalent of using weapons of mass destruction. So this basically means words do not have meaning. A cultural reform is a weapon of mass destruction. Or he calls his war a special military operation. But there's also another way in which Putin follows on Dugin's steps, and this is Putin's collectivism. So if you go back and you read some texts or some speeches that Putin made to justify the war in Ukraine, you will see this submission to the group and the submission to tradition. So Putin basically says, Ukraine has been Russia since forever. And he gives this example. In the 14th century, there was this religious figure who said that our language is the same. So to translate this in the current world, there's the Ukrainians who say, we want to be free. We don't want to live under your reign. And Putin says, tough luck. Because we are one, because we are bound by tradition. Tradition and the, quote, ethnic group is destiny. So this geopolitical determinism that is present in Dugin is also present on Putin. And one last thing I want to say on that Ziemowit is perhaps the darkest and perhaps the scariest product of Dugin's philosophy is this death worship. Because if the individual is of no importance, if having nice things in life is of no importance, at some point in his fourth political theory, Dugin says, the washing machine is overrated. Why do you need it? People have lived without it. Progress is not necessarily a good thing. So he has this vision that we need to go back to a life which is more agrarian. So you see that for him, your pursuit in your life is not very important. But this means that also for him, life itself is not important. And you, as an individual, you are not important. So recently, when he was asked about the war in Ukraine, which, as you said, Ziemowit, he wholeheartedly approves, and actually he's critical of Putin because he wants to go even harder against the Ukrainians. Someone asked him, what will happen to this war? And Dugin says, quote, there are two possibilities. It will end when we win. It's not too easy, though. And the second possibility is that this fight will end with the end of the world. Either we win or the world will be destroyed. End of quote. Let me read this again, the last part. Either we win or the world will be destroyed. And Dugin is not the only opinion maker, let's say, in Russia who holds this view. We see we see propagandists like Vladimir Solovyov, the famous Russian TV propagandist, who only a couple of days ago said on TV that he literally said life is overrated. So if you die on the front, it's okay because life is not that great anyway. If you follow me on Twitter, I tweeted, I think yesterday, that particular clip because it's one of the things that you have to see it to believe it. But also, we have other figures in Russia like the Patriarch Kirill, who also see the invasion of Ukraine as this almost spiritual experience, the war as being a spiritual experience. Now, Ziemowit, we've also heard Ayn Rand making some claims about the
Yeah.
what he calls the sense of life of the Russian culture and how it views death and suffering. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so Rand had a very low opinion of Russian culture and also Russian history. She believed that it's a country and nation that it's basically steeped in religion, in faith, in sacrifice, humility, and servility, and you can see that throughout the whole Russian history. But in a 1967 interview with Johnny Carson, she said explicitly, and I quote, "I am opposed to the whole Russian culture, which is a mystical one." Now, again, I am opposed to the whole Russian culture, which is a mystical one. Now, she also said that she likes or even admires a few writers, but apart from that, she views Russian culture as again a mystical one. And I think that when we look at Dugin, at what he says, what he's done in his life, being a member of a Black Order of SS, or being a member or of various sects, being an advocate of anti-reason, of irrationality. I think he's a walking embodiment of Russian mysticism. If you think about it, he is
And
like an
he
exemplification.
would agree actually. He would agree with Rand. He would say, yes, indeed. You in the West, you care about happiness, about material. We in Russia, we care about things like the superior values, which he considers, for example, suffering, dying for something greater. He considers the superior value. So it's not even that we are making a case that the Dugin will say, "Oh, I'm offended by this view." He'd say, "Yes, of course, we are. This is exactly who we are."
Yeah, I mean, if you read his political Platonism, what he basically says there that there is this world of forms or ideas that is this perfect world, and that the material world is a lesser one, it's inferior, and that we should be thinking, our hearts, our minds should be directed towards this true reality of ideas or forms. So yeah, he's pretty explicit about it. But I know that
And
he also
speaking of
had some comments on Rand herself, Nikos.
yeah, one of the most hilarious parts of reading the fourth political theory was the page where he refers to Ayn Rand. So he has the understanding, his understanding of Ayn Rand is the understanding of a really, really bad first year politics or sociology university student in a bad university. So he says things like, Ayn Rand believes that if you are rich, you're a good person, and that the rich should oppress the poor. So he hasn't even probably visited Ayn Rand's Wikipedia page. Now, I want to finish with one last thing, though, here, Zimovit, because
Yeah.
for me, this is very important. Why is it that some people in the so-called dissident right or the new right, or however you want to call it, why do they find this character appealing? Why does Steve Bannon find Dugin appealing? Why is it that the paleo-conservative Paul Gottfried, with very strong links also with prominent libertarian institutions, Why did he write the foreword to one of the books of Dugin? Why is it that Dugin has been featured in libertarian podcasts? Why has he been interviewed by the podcast and by various prominent dissident rightists in the United States, and not interviewed in terms of, look what this guy is saying, but, oh, you have so many interesting things to tell us more. He's even been in Alex Jones some years ago, and he has had impact on the alternative right. So here you have movements which supposedly want to save the West from decadence, who supposedly want to save the West from postmodernist neo-Marxists or whatever. And you see these people finding Dugin quite interesting. So, and I'm asking myself why. It takes 5 seconds to even go in his Wikipedia page to figure out what Dugin is about. Because all the things we discussed today, he doesn't keep them secret. He's open with all these things. So I wonder, could it be that for these people, for some paleoconservatives or paleolibertarians, is it that for them also modernity is an anathema? Is it for them also a problem that reason is an enemy because it has put aside religion and mysticism? Could it be that also for them, the United States is the empire of evil? And is it that also for them, individualism is something which is to be crushed? So I would say this as my, let's say, call to arms, that if you want to save the West, if you really actually understand what is good about the West, what is good about the Enlightenment, and what is good about freedom, then you have to throw to the bin all the political movements that have become trendy lately that tell you that actually reason and individualism is a problem. And this would also include throwing to the bin movements such as the National Conservatives. Now, I know that at least the good people in the National Conservative movement would say, we don't want anything to do with someone like Dugin. But notice that they also believe that this alliance between conservatism and liberalism has been a big mistake. They also believe that reason is overrated, and they also believe that tradition is more important than freedom. So there are many movements out there today that are quite appealing to some people because supposedly they go against the left. But it is important to ask ourselves, if a movement shares the premise that individualism is bad, that reason is overrated, and that whatever the West and symbolizes, this idea of that we succeed in life via trade, via production, all these movements that consider these ideas quite bad, ask yourself, how far are they in their premises by a dark figure like Dugin? So that's all I wanted to say.
Nikos,
Yes.
before we wrap up, now that you've mentioned all those individuals and groups that are allegedly pro-West, but nonetheless, in some way or another, support Dugin or think about him as an important figure, as an important
Or share his
intellectual.
premises, even if they say we don't like the guy.
Now, so it actually reminded me of a quote from Rand from her essay, The Lessons of Vietnam. Now, at the beginning of this essay, she's describing the time during the Russian Civil War when she was a teenager. And she says, I wondered, even in those years, which is morally worse, evil or the appeasement of evil, the cowardly evasion that leaves an evil unnamed, unanswered, and unchallenged. And so I believe that Dugin is evil, is an evil person, an evil thinker, but we should also remember about those who appease what's evil.
How crazy it is that the person who was the number one, let's say, ideological influence on Trump, Steve Bannon, was someone who considered Dugin a very interesting thinker. It's unbelievable to think about it. Anyway, Ziemowit. So what happens? What happens next week?
Yeah. So next week we are going to hold Q&A on religion and God, and Rand's view of reason and faith with Aaron Smith and Mike Matza and myself as a moderator on, I think, January 13th. So please send your questions at newideal@aynrand.org. Please also send us questions for future Q&A episodes. Now, if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe to our channel. Click this bell button to get notification. Leave a like, a comment, and again, if you enjoy this podcast, share it with your friends on your social media. And also, if you have any questions or comments about this, about today's episode, you can always write to us an email at, again, newideal at aynrand.org.
Or also, if you have suggestions for future episode, is there another thinker who you think is important or influential and we need to cover? Send us your suggestions on that email. So, Ziemowit, thank you for being thank you for this. Many thanks to our audience, and see you soon.
My pleasure. See you soon, guys. Bye.